Hey, good afternoon. It's Derek. Another daily chapter of James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. If you haven't gotten the book yet, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. Let's remind ourselves while we're here today. It's January of 2021. Today is January 10th. A lot of people, including myself, love to make New Year's resolutions. A lot of people, including myself, are really good at not keeping New Year's resolutions. And the statistic that alarmed me, one of the reasons I started on this journey with Atomic Habits each day, is the fact that by January 12th, which is coming up very soon if you're following these videos in real time, by January 12th, most people have already left their New Year's resolutions behind. It's less than 2 weeks that people give up on their New Year's resolutions, give up on their habits, and give up on their goals. So the idea is to go through a chapter of this book a day. It's going to take us about 3 weeks to get through it, to help us get past the January 12th slump date, to keep on going, to keep going through the entire year so that we sit here at the beginning of January 2022 and we can look back and we can say, holy cow, I've kept my New Year's resolutions. Or if you're following this after the fact, not in January 2021, the goal is to help you create new habits that last. In our last video, we talked about how your environment can dictate or help dictate the type of habits that you have. And we're supposed to create an environment that helps support the habits that we want. Today, we're going to zoom into that idea a little bit more. It's a really, really fascinating chapter. It's not very long, but I hope you dive into it with me because it has the potential to fundamentally change the way that you'll go about creating habits, especially when it comes to the idea of self-control. Because we all think, and to an extent it's true, that there's a certain amount of motivation and self-control that's needed to create new habits. This chapter is going to put a very different spin on the idea of self-control and motivation when it comes to actually creating new habits. So the chapter starts out with a story, and I mentioned it not in much detail in the last video, but I want to talk about the details here. And he outlines it in the book, so I'm going to make sure I get all the statistics right. But in 1971, Vietnam War was going on. Over 35% of the service members in Vietnam had tried heroin, and as many as 20% were actually addicted to heroin overseas in Vietnam. Shortly afterward, when the soldiers were coming back from Vietnam, there's a large concern that all these soldiers were going to be coming back to the States, back to their friends, back to their families, and continuing this heroin addiction use. What they found out was that I think it was only 5% of the soldiers became re-addicted within a year, and just 12% of them relapsed within 3 years. What does that mean? 9 out of 10 soldiers that were addicted to heroin in Vietnam came back to the States. 9 out of 10 of them came back and were not addicted anymore. This is very counterintuitive to what everybody assumes to be true about habits, that you can, by drastically changing the environment, almost cause a habit to completely dissolve. That's not the way we understood habits to work. But this idea started, or this research into these soldiers coming back from Vietnam started this idea that the environment has a massive part, massive part in creating or sustaining habits or helping change habits. Here's really what it boils down to: is when the context changed, when the environment changed, so did the habit. The cues that were in Vietnam that caused the soldiers to use heroin on a regular basis, to be addicted to it, those cues, the stress of the war, hanging out with friends who were also using heroin, other things, those cues, they were not existent back in the States. And so because the cue wasn't there, the craving for the heroin wasn't there, and they dropped heroin. They were no longer addicted to it because the context changed and the cue that begins the habit, the action of the habit changed. So what it really boils down to is that disciplined people are just simply better at structuring their lives in a way that does not require heroic willpower and self-control. And I'm reading this from the book because the words and the way he says it is really, really important to this fundamental idea. So it's not that people have an amazing amount of discipline or self-control and just a heroic amount of self-control to change their habits. It's that they design and structure their environment to actually support the type of habits they want. I'm going to read this paragraph, so bear with me, but it says exactly what the best way to say it. So I'm going to read it. The people with the best self-control are typically the ones who actually need to use it the least, because it's easier to practice self-restraint when you don't have to use it very often. So self-restraint is like a muscle. When you use it, it gets tired of being used. So often perseverance, grit, and willpower are essential to success. But the way to improve these qualities, here you go, ready? The way to improve these qualities is not by wishing you were a more disciplined person, but by creating a more disciplined environment. So the environment that we live in, if it's a type of environment that supports the habits we want, we will become the person that we want because we live in the environment that supports being the type of person we want. And let's dig in a little bit more as he keeps going through this chapter about how a habit is actually formed and why tying a habit back to a cue and removing that cue is so important in helping reinforce the discipline necessary to create the habits that we want. Habits are encoded into our brain. When we associate a cue with a craving and form a habit based on the cue, that cue is always stuck in our brain. Whenever we experience that cue, that craving will come back. And he used, James Clear, the author, used a story about a therapist from Austin. She started smoking when she would light up when she was riding horses with her friends. Well, she moved away and she no longer rode horses with her friends, and she just stopped smoking because the cue to smoke was riding horses with her friend. Well, years has gone by. She hadn't smoked for all those years, and she went to go ride horses with a friend again. And immediately, just like that, years later, all of a sudden she was craving a cigarette because the cue, the wiring for the habit never quite leaves our brain. We just leave the environment where that cue is stored. So once the habit has been encoded, the urge to act follows whenever that environmental cue appears. And so it's that kind of the idea, and he goes into this, that bad habits, which obviously we're trying to stop bad habits and create good habits. Bad habits are autocatalytic in that the process feeds itself. So when you feel bad, you eat junk food. Well, what does junk food do? It makes you feel bad. So what do? You eat junk food. Watching television makes you sluggish. And so what do? You watch more television because you feel sluggish, and it makes you feel, so you watch more television because you're sluggish. It's this cycle that feeds itself. And as long as we're in the environment of feeling sluggish when watching TV, that cycle is just going to keep on continuing. Once you notice something, you begin wanting it. And once you're in the environment, when that cue is around, you want it. So here's the punchline. If you're going to remember just one thing from this chapter today, this is the one that you need to remember. So tune in right here. You can break a habit, but you're unlikely to forget it. The habits are carved into our brain. And so what that matters to you and to me is the idea that if we want to stop a bad habit, we need to get out of the environment in which that habit exists. We need to create an environment that supports the good habit that we want. The mental grooves of the bad habit are always left in our brain, are always wired into our being. And so it's not about making it, having the self-discipline to overcome and restrain ourselves. It's about creating a brand new environment. It's easier to avoid temptation than it is to resist it. If there's always cookies on the counter when I walk into the kitchen, it's really, really hard for me to resist eating those cookies all the time. But if those cookies are gone, if I create an environment in my kitchen that I don't allow cookies to be there, for example, I don't have to resist temptation. I can just completely, I can avoid it instead of just resisting it. Because those habits, as soon as the cookies are there, even if I'm not hungry, even if I haven't thought about cookies in a week, as soon as the cookies appear, I'm going to want them. So it's easier to avoid it than it is to resist it. So the one takeaway from this lesson, or from this chapter, is the idea that create the environment that supports the habits you want, because the cue that creates the craving that forms the habit or reinforces the habit, it has everything to do with the context that habit exists in. So if you want to change a bad habit, take something out or change the environment that habit exists in. If you want to form a good habit, create an environment in which that habit can exist that supports it. So it's not about self-control as much as it is about the environment that supports the type of being that you want to be. So again, I'm going to read this one more time. Disciplined people are better at structuring their lives in a way that does not require heroic willpower and self-control. And there's one sentence in here that I want to read. The author has interviewed and studied people with habits for years, and he says this, and it's a very, very plain statement. I've never seen someone consistently stick to positive habits in a negative environment. It's all about your environment. So zoom out for a second. Think about the environment in which your bad habits exist and change that environment. You'll find it's less about self-control and more about the environment that you create to help support the habits that you want to have. Have a good afternoon.